This video will cover most of the table in the chart titled Presidential and Congressional Reconstruction. Reconstruction dealt with the entrance of the former Confederate states back into the Union, as well as the legal status of the former slaves. Presidents Lincoln and Andrew Johnson had very different perspectives on Reconstruction than Congress did. So we will look at these two positions and visions of what should happen in the South. The middle column in bold print gives the basic themes of the Reconstruction. The positions of each side present the presidential position on the left and the congressional position on the right. For the first position, strategy and policy of Reconstruction, the presidents saw the object of Reconstruction as bringing former Confederate states back into, to use Lincoln words, a proper practical relation with the Union. Regardless of what these former Confederate states had done in the past, Lincoln wanted to make them states in the Union again as quickly as possible. Congress took another perspective, saying that these Confederate states formed a separate country, were conquered, and could be ruled as conquered provinces. Congress saw no need to quickly get those former Confederate states back into the Union, especially if they were not making necessary reforms. Lincoln presented his approach with his proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction in 1863. Now, Congress thought this was a bit of a power grab by the president. Lincoln, of course, as president, was allowed his own opinion as to how the former Confederate states should re-enter the Union. But congressional leaders held that districts from the Confederacy could only be readmitted to the Union by laws, which, of course, are enacted by Congress. So Congress pushed back, and with the Wade-Davis Bill of 1864, gave its own terms for readmission to the Union. The next row deals with abolition and black suffrage, suffrage meaning the right to vote. On the presidential side, I have required and gradual. Lincoln required the former Confederate states to approve of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. Now, as far as the black vote is concerned, Lincoln wanted to see a gradual approach. He wanted to see at least some groups of black men voting, such as Union Army veterans, property owners, or those who could pass a literacy test, with more progress coming later. So again, the presidential plan required abolition and wanted gradual black suffrage implemented. For the congressional side, I put required and immediate. Congress, like the president, required the former Confederate states to ratify the 13th Amendment. So in that regard, the two approaches were the same. But Congress went further than Lincoln did with the question of black suffrage and insisted that these states change their constitutions to prevent withholding the right to vote on the basis of race. In other words, calling for the immediate implementation of the black vote. Nowadays, scholars inevitably come down on the side of Congress and say that the approach of Congress was the best approach. It is hard to argue against Congress here, in that if white men could vote, why couldn't black men? The reasoning is sound. The only issue I would have with that is the application of that approach. Let me bring to mind a letter that Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, wrote on this topic to a European abolitionist, the Duchess of Argyll, in 1866. Stowe wrote, "Southern elections have always been scenes of mob violence when only white men voted. Multitudes of lives have been lost at the polls in this way, and if against their will Negro suffrage was forced upon them, I do not see how anyone in their senses can expect anything less than an immediate war of races." End quote. Stowe went on to say that if pressed, the former Confederate states would merely change the wording of their state constitutions, but not actually let blacks vote. So the approach of Lincoln would be to say, why push for something you're not going to get anyways, and which very well might eliminate the few gains you are going to make? At any rate, I think Lincoln's approach has more wisdom than people nowadays give him credit for. The next issue was an oath of loyalty. Nowadays, we don't put much trust in oaths and in what people say in general. We don't accept things as true unless we can see it in writing. Back then, things were different. It was understood by everyone, regardless of your political beliefs, that a man of honor would not lie. He would not say anything that he didn't believe to be true. And so Lincoln's approach to the oath of loyalty that these former Confederates would give to the Union was that 10% of those former Confederates who were voting in 1860 had to swear an oath of loyalty to the Union, that they would be loyal in the future. Now, after the Civil War, when these states had lost the war, you could see that finding 10% of that number who would say, okay, we lost the war, so let's at least be loyal Americans from here on out, finding 10% might be easy. But Congress looked at this plan and thought Lincoln was being hopelessly naive. They looked at the 10% number and said, if you can only find 10% of these former Confederates to be loyal to the Union in the future, that means that 90% of those former Confederates are not going to be loyal to the Union in the future. And so Congress demanded 50% of those former Confederates to swear that not only would they be loyal to the Union in the future, but that they were loyal to the Union in the past. And until such a large percentage of men would take that oath, those states would not be readmitted to the Union. Now, another question, a point of dispute, was the Freedmen's Bureau. As thousands of runaway slaves flocked into Washington, D.C. during the war, the Freedmen's Bureau was set up to provide shelter, clothing, food for them. Freedmen's Bureau laws also insisted that blacks enjoy all the legal privileges that whites were enjoying, and enacted jurisdiction for Freedmen's Bureau agents to support the freedmen if that wasn't the case. Finally, these laws provided for abandoned and confiscated lands in the South to be distributed to the freedmen. During the Civil War, in fact, some Union generals started distributing land on plantations to the former slaves who worked the land, and these laws ratified that practice. Now, President Andrew Johnson vetoed this law when it came up for renewal in February 1866. Congress overrode Johnson's veto. Moving down to the fate row. The presidential plan was politically dead in the water when a joint committee from the House of Representatives and the Senate met in April 1866 and committed to the position that they would not let any state into the Union unless their Constitution explicitly called for the black vote. And so that meant the presidential plan was dead. No state was going to be readmitted to the Union under that plan. And so by 1870, all of the 11 former Confederate states had been readmitted to the Union under the Congressional Plan.